Spring 1943. The North African desert was finished. On May 12th, the last units of the Afrika Korps stacked their rifles in Tunisia. Nearly 250,000 Axis soldiers, German and Italian, surrendered in what American records described as the largest mass capitulation of enemy forces since 1918. The prisoners braced for starvation. Nazi propaganda had prepared them. Americans were weak, corrupt, and vengeful. Capture meant cruelty, perhaps death. "We were told we would be beaten and left to rot," one former soldier recalled in a 1946 interrogation. "Better to die in Africa than fall into American hands." Yet within hours, those same men were handed rations that their own families back in Germany had not seen for years. U.S. Army quartermaster records confirmed that the first meals provided to prisoners at the processing camps in North Africa contained canned beef, white bread, butter, jam, fruit, coffee, and cigarettes. The official ration scale for prisoners in May 1943 allocated roughly 3,300 calories per man per day, already higher than what many German combat units were receiving in the field. To the Germans, it was incomprehensible. A corporal from the 90th Light Division wrote in a letter later intercepted by censors, "They gave us bread that was white, not black, butter in portions so large we thought it was cheese. We feared it was a trick. Who feeds their enemies such food?" For comparison, German field rations at the time had deteriorated to coarse rye bread, ersatz coffee, and thin stews. Meat was rare, sugar almost absent. Letters from Afrika Korps veterans describe surviving on fewer than 1,500 calories a day in the final weeks of the campaign. Now, in captivity, they were presented with canned peaches, real coffee, and Camel cigarettes, items most German civilians considered unobtainable luxuries. U.S. Guards noticed the disbelief. Sergeant William Grant of the 47th Infantry later testified in an Army oral history. "They stared at the bread like it was gold. Some wouldn't touch it at first. A few whispered to each other that maybe it was poisoned. But once the first man ate, they all followed." The shock ran deeper than hunger. In Nazi training manuals, America was portrayed as disorganized, racially degenerate, incapable of sustained war. Yet here were Liberty ships unloading crates of food in Tunis, not just for American GIs, but for their prisoners. Quartermaster records list shipments of powdered eggs, tinned ham, evaporated milk, and orange juice concentrate, all earmarked for prisoner rations. A Luftwaffe mechanic captured near Bizerte remembered his astonishment at the cigarettes. Every man received a pack. In Germany, even officers had to trade favors for tobacco. "I held mine in my hand for a long time before I dared smoke. It seemed impossible."
The generosity unsettled them. An Afrika Korps officer, interviewed by the International Red Cross in 1944, put it bluntly, "We expected to be starved. Instead, the Americans fed us better in defeat than our own army had in victory." The first weeks of captivity created a pattern that would repeat across the Atlantic. German prisoners were not treated as subhuman enemies, but as men to be maintained. The Geneva Convention required adequate food. The United States went beyond adequacy. Mess halls served beans with bacon, potatoes with gravy, bread with butter. For many prisoners, it was the first time since 1939 they had eaten 3 full meals daily. The contrast was so sharp that some prisoners wondered if they had misunderstood the war itself. Why would an enemy give away abundance in a desert where supply was supposed to be the greatest challenge? In a debriefing filed by 13th Fighter Command in June 1943, one interrogated officer admitted, "We told our men that America could never supply an army overseas, but the evidence of our mouths proved otherwise." Thus, the war for German minds began not with leaflets or lectures, but with bread, butter, and canned peaches. The very first taste of captivity was also the very first taste of doubt. The statistics told their own story. In 1943, a U.S. Army soldier's daily ration averaged between 3,700 and 4,000 calories. The Quartermaster General's reports from that year list generous allocations of meat, bread, vegetables, sugar, and coffee. By contrast, the Wehrmacht ration scales, especially for troops on the Eastern Front, had declined to 2,000 calories or less, often eked out with ersatz substitutes. In Africa, cut off by Allied naval power, German units sometimes survived on half that. The prisoners understood the difference in their stomachs long before they read the numbers. "I gained weight within 3 weeks of captivity," wrote a captured Africa Corps private in a 1945 testimony. "In the desert, we had marched on empty stomachs. In America, we worked on full ones." The calorie gap was not just a matter of health. It became a weapon against ideology. Nazi propaganda had insisted that America was decadent, racially impure, and incapable of sustained war production. Yet every meal contradicted that teaching. Where Germany measured coffee in grams, Americans poured it freely. Where Germans rationed sugar to 280 grams per month for civilians, Americans put bowls of it on POW mess tables. Where cigarettes were a black market luxury in Europe, American guards handed them out as part of the daily ration. Quartermaster records from 1943 show that a standard prisoner ration included bread, 14 ounces daily, usually white wheat bread;
Meat, 6 to 8 ounces. Vegetables, 12 ounces. Sugar, 2 ounces. Coffee, 1 ounce. Real, not ersatz. Cigarettes, 7 per day, often supplemented by canteen sales. This was food at a level most German civilians had not seen since before the war. Some prisoners wrote home in astonishment, though their letters were heavily censored. In one intercepted letter preserved in the U.S. National Archives, a soldier described his disbelief. "Every man has meat every day. Coffee in cups so large we cannot drink it all. They give us butter, not margarine. We live here like kings compared with Germany." The U.S. censor struck out sentences that directly criticized conditions back home, but the sense of wonder remains in the fragments that survived. For U.S. guards, the reactions were almost comical. Sergeant Harold Davis of the 803rd Military Police Battalion recalled, "They thought we were showing off. Some wouldn't eat until they saw us eating the same food. Then they began to trust it." Trust was key. The act of being fed day after day with consistency and generosity began to undermine the most deeply held beliefs about America. German officers in particular found themselves struggling. They had been taught that America's abundance was shallow, built on jazz, Jews, and Hollywood illusions. But the bread was real. The butter melted on the tongue. The calories restored energy that the desert had burned away. Historians later noted that nutrition became a subtle form of re-education. Arnold Kramer, the leading historian of German POWs in America, described it as the mathematics of abundance. Every loaf of bread and every spoonful of sugar represented industrial capacity on a scale the Reich could not match. Prisoners who doubted America's ability to sustain war now experienced its power 3 times a day. Not all accepted the lesson immediately. Some hardened Nazis insisted that the abundance was temporary, a theatrical trick. A U.S. interrogation report from Camp Crossville, Tennessee, in July 1943 recorded one officer saying, "This display cannot last. When Germany attacks your homeland, you will be the ones starving." Yet such claims grew harder to maintain as the months passed and the food kept arriving. Medical officers recorded the physical changes. Army physicians noted that German prisoners often arrived malnourished, many underweight, some with vitamin deficiencies.
Within months, average weight increased by 10 to 15 pounds. Dental inspections revealed cavities from years of sugar shortages. Now, prisoners were consuming candy bars and sweetened coffee. The body did not lie. Prisoners could dismiss propaganda leaflets, but they could not dismiss the fullness in their stomachs. By late 1943, rumors circulated among prisoners that American soldiers sometimes complained about their own rations. To the Germans, this was incomprehensible. If our army had been given such food, no one would ever complain, one prisoner remarked to his interrogators. The contrast created a deeper ideological crisis. Nazi Germany had exalted sacrifice, hunger, and deprivation as noble. But here, in captivity, enemies lived better than German civilians. The supposed decadence of American society revealed itself as resilience, not weakness. Abundance was not the opposite of discipline, it was its product. The numbers themselves became arguments. Prisoners working in camp offices sometimes had access to quartermaster tallies, tons of flour delivered weekly, gallons of milk ordered, thousands of pounds of sugar consumed. One recalled after the war, the numbers were like a weapon. We realized America was fighting with food as much as with bullets. Thus, ideology began to unravel not through lectures or films, but through calories carefully measured out on tin plates. Hunger had been one of the Reich's tools of control. Abundance became democracy's reply. By late 1943, German prisoners had grown accustomed to the rhythm of camp life in the United States. They worked, wrote censored letters, and marched to meals. But every so often, something appeared on the ration tables that shattered expectations entirely. American candy and soft drinks. For Germans raised in the austerity of wartime Europe, these items bordered on fantasy. Chocolate had been rationed in Germany since 1939, reserved mostly for officers, children, and special occasions. Coca-Cola, though briefly available in pre-war Germany, had been cut off by the Allied blockade. Now, in captivity, men who had fought under Rommel were sipping bottles of Coke and unwrapping Hershey bars. Quartermaster records show that prisoners received candy on a rotating basis, often distributed during holidays or after work details. A typical treat was the Hershey 2-ounce chocolate bar, the same issued to American GIs. Coca-Cola bottling plants, which operated near several POW camps, provided soda by the crate when local commanders requisitioned it. One intercepted letter from a prisoner at Camp Swift, Texas, read, "We were given chocolate for Christmas. I had forgotten the taste. It melted in my mouth, and for a moment I was a boy again. It is unbelievable that the enemy gives us such things." The censor underlined the word unbelievable before the letter was filed.
U.S. guards were struck by the reactions. Lieutenant Charles M. Harris, serving at Camp Aliceville, Alabama, recalled in an oral history, "When Coca-Cola showed up, they handled the bottles like museum pieces. Some of them just stared at the fizz before they dared drink. They didn't believe it was for them." Psychologists attached to the War Department noted the symbolic power of these luxuries. Chocolate and soda were not mere calories. They represented industrial capacity, consumer culture, and an idea of abundance utterly foreign to the German wartime experience. A 1944 Army intelligence memorandum described it this way: "Each Coca-Cola consumed by a prisoner of war conveys to him the reality of American productive power more effectively than any lecture or film." The shock was not only about sweetness, but about scale. A POW who later testified at the 1962 U.S.-Japanese Aviation History Symposium remembered his awe. "The Americans had so much, they gave it even to prisoners. We understood then that the war was lost. A nation that can waste chocolate on its enemies cannot be defeated." The waste was strategic. By 1943, U.S. officials believed that treating POWs well would pay dividends both in compliance and in propaganda value. Interrogation reports from the 13th Fighter Command note that cooperative prisoners often cited their treatment as proof that America did not match the caricature painted by Nazi leaders. Sweetness softened resistance. Some prisoners, however, struggled with the implications. Hardened Nazis accused their comrades of weakness for enjoying Jewish American products. One camp report from Nebraska describes a heated argument after Christmas 1943. A lieutenant berated younger prisoners for cheering like children when candy was handed out. Yet the scolding rang hollow when the officer himself was later seen sneaking a second bar. Medical officers noted an unexpected consequence: tooth decay. Years of sugar shortages had left German dental health paradoxically strong. Within months of exposure to American candy and soda, dentists recorded cavities. But even as fillings became common, few prisoners complained. "Better to have a toothache with chocolate than perfect teeth without it," one joked to his interrogator. The symbolism extended beyond the camp fences. Local civilians sometimes saw German POWs buying candy or soda with camp pay at nearby canteens. To many Americans, it was a strange sight, former enemies laughing over Coca-Colas in small-town diners. To the prisoners, it was a revelation. Their chapters not only tolerated such indulgence, they encouraged it. Post-war memoirs frequently recall the first taste of Coke or Hershey's. A veteran of the 15th Panzer Division wrote in 1985, "I realized then that our leaders had lied. They told us America was weak. But weak nations do not give chocolate to prisoners." Thus, a simple bar of chocolate or a fizzy bottle of soda became more than a treat. They were symbols of a world where plenty defeated scarcity, where sweetness itself carried the weight of industry and progress. It was a taste of the new world that would follow. If the food astonished them, the medical care unsettled them even more. By the time German prisoners arrived in the United States in mid-1943, many carried untreated wounds from North Africa. Others suffered from malaria, dysentery, or malnutrition. In Germany, medicine was scarce and often rationed. Civilians lined up for aspirin, bandages, or sulfa tablets, and frontline soldiers sometimes went weeks without proper treatment. At the POW camps, the rules were different. Under the Geneva Convention, America was obliged to provide medical attention equal to that of its own troops. In practice, this meant full access to U.S. Army hospitals, pharmaceuticals, and trained doctors. Quartermaster records and Surgeon General reports confirmed that German POWs received sulfonamides, penicillin when it became available in 1944, quinine, and surgical operations, all at no cost. Prisoners could hardly believe it. An Africa Corps lieutenant, interrogated in 1944, recalled his astonishment. "I expected no more than disinfectant and a bandage. Instead, they operated on my leg with the same care as if I were an American soldier. It was the first time I doubted the Reich's words." U.S. guards and medics remembered similar reactions. Private First Class Robert Larkin, who worked as an orderly at Camp Polk, Louisiana, later told the National World War II Museum, "They looked shocked that we would waste medicine on them. One man kept asking if his family back home would have the same chance. He couldn't understand why the enemy would be treated better than German civilians." The contrast was stark. In Germany, by 1943, even frontline hospitals were running low on morphine, chloroquine, and basic antiseptics. German Red Cross reports mention amputations carried out without anesthesia. In the U.S., meanwhile, prisoners were given dental care, eye exams, inoculations, and sometimes even prosthetic limbs. One former prisoner, interviewed in 1985 at the Pacific Theater Veterans Reunion in Hawaii, put it bluntly, "They gave me new teeth,
My own army gave me no shoes. Medical care also became a quiet tool of persuasion. Army intelligence officers noted that grateful prisoners often became more cooperative in interrogation after being treated. A 1943 report from the Air Force Historical Research Agency observed medical services, especially surgical procedures, appeared to produce significant goodwill among German captives, who frequently remark on the contrast with shortages in Germany. Not everyone trusted the generosity. Some hardened Nazis whispered that the medicine was experimental or a way to weaken them. A captured sergeant in Texas claimed in a Red Cross interview, "They give us injections to make us docile." But repeated recoveries and visible improvements eroded suspicion. When malaria patients began to regain strength after quinine treatment, rumors of poisoning lost credibility. The American public sometimes expressed resentment. Local newspapers near large camps occasionally printed letters from civilians asking why scarce penicillin or hospital beds were being wasted on the enemy. But U.S. officials held firm. Adherence to the Geneva Convention was essential, not just for medical care, but also for future efforts at re-education and denazification. The idea was simple: treat them as human beings.
Was a matter of national honor. Secretary of War Henry Stimson declared in 1943, "We do not treat men as less than human, even when they have been our foes." For the prisoners, this principle was almost incomprehensible. Nazi Germany had routinely starved Soviet POWs, denied them medical care, and allowed millions to die. The Reich had defined cruelty as normal. To encounter mercy, systematic, bureaucratic, and efficient, was to face a different moral universe. One German doctor held as a prisoner in Georgia later admitted during post-war interrogations, "I could not explain to my comrades why the Americans treated our sick. It contradicted everything we had been told about them. The care was not propaganda, it was consistent. That made it more powerful than any film or leaflet." By 1944, the pattern was clear. POWs gained weight, recovered from wounds, and returned to labor details healthier than when they had been captured. Some even wrote home, though censors often cut the lines, about American hospitals better than our own. The experience planted a dangerous idea in their minds. If the enemy treated them with such care, perhaps their own leaders had betrayed them? In the words of one Luftwaffe mechanic recorded in 1946, "We went to war thinking we were the master race. In the hospital, with an American nurse taking my temperature, I began to wonder who truly was civilized." By 1944, the war had carried German prisoners thousands of miles from Tunisia to the heart of the American countryside. Scattered across the South, Midwest, and Plains, POW camps became part of the rural landscape. The Geneva Convention required that captives be given meaningful work, and the United States, facing severe labor shortages with millions of men overseas, put the prisoners to use. The arrangement surprised the Germans. They expected chain gangs, brutality, or idleness behind barbed wire. Instead, they found themselves riding trucks out to farms, factories, and timber camps. U.S. Army Service Forces directives established a clear framework. Prisoners would be paid 80 cents per day in camp coupons, usable at canteens for cigarettes, candy, or toiletries. They would not be forced into dangerous work, but assigned to agriculture, logging, or light industry. On the farms of Iowa, Texas, and Georgia, the sight of German soldiers in faded Afrika Korps uniforms picking cotton or harvesting wheat became familiar. Farmers were instructed not to fraternize, but curiosity often overrode regulation. They worked hard and seemed glad for the food we gave them at noon, one Nebraska farmer's wife told an interviewer in 1945. "I never thought the enemy would sit at my table and drink milk like a neighbor boy." For the prisoners, the milk and meals often mattered more than the wages. Farm families sometimes provided sandwiches, pie, or cold lemonade. Coming from a Europe where civilians tightened belts and ration cards ruled, these moments carried immense weight. A POW diary seized in 1944 described the astonishment. "They treat us like hired help, not like slaves. We eat beside them. They laugh and speak kindly. It is confusing."
Still, the money system fascinated them. Camp coupons could be exchanged at the post canteen for soap, razor blades, stationery, or, most astonishingly, luxuries like Coca-Cola and Lucky Strikes. An Africa Corps private, recalled after the war, "I earned more chocolate and cigarettes in 1 month of captivity than in 2 years of service for Germany." American guards noted the prisoners' disbelief. Captain Roy Barker, a camp commander in Arkansas, reported in a 1944 memorandum, "Many captives insist the wages must be a trick. When they see their coupons redeemed, they are incredulous. They remark that even German civilians do not enjoy such purchasing power." The ideological implications deepened. Nazi propaganda had portrayed America as a land of class conflict and exploitation. Yet here, prisoners labored and were paid fairly, even while the nation was at war with them. A former Luftwaffe mechanic, interrogated in 1945, reflected, "I was told I would be treated as an animal. Instead, I was treated as a worker. This was harder to resist than any lecture." Work also provided dignity. Many prisoners were restless in the camps, unused to idleness after years of military service. Farm labor restored routine and purpose. Agricultural Extension Service reports noted that POW labor saved entire harvests in 1944, preventing crop loss during manpower shortages. Farmers often wrote letters to camp commanders requesting "our Germans back" for the next season. Not every American welcomed the arrangement. Local newspapers sometimes printed complaints that Nazis eat better than our families, or that loyal citizens should not see enemies rewarded with wages. But officials defended the policy, citing both the Geneva Convention and the practical need for labor. Among the prisoners, the experience left lasting impressions. At the 1985 Pacific Theater Veterans Reunion, one former POW described his astonishment. "We were paid, fed, and thanked for work. The regime told us Americans were barbarians, but barbarians do not pay the enemy to harvest wheat." The farm work also created fleeting moments of cultural exchange. Prisoners learned baseball from local boys, practiced English with farmers' children, and sometimes sang German folk songs while cutting timber. Such memories, preserved in letters and oral histories, became part of their post-war reflections. The wages, small as they were, represented more than money. They symbolized fairness, rule of law, and an economic system built on trust rather than coercion. For men raised in a dictatorship, it was bewildering. A guard at Camp Hearn in Texas summed it up in his debriefing. "The rations filled their stomachs, but the wages got in their heads." Thus, with every bale of cotton picked and every coupon spent at the camp canteen, the prisoners experienced another quiet dismantling of their old world view. America was proving itself not through lectures or slogans, but through milk at a farm table and coins of labor in a POW's pocket.
For German prisoners in America, letters were lifelines. Each man was permitted 2 letters and 4 postcards per month, written in pencil on standardized forms. All were censored, read line by U.S. officers trained in German. Even so, these scraps of writing became windows through which the shock of captivity leaked back into the Reich. The tone of those letters was often cautious. Prisoners knew their words passed through enemy hands, and they feared reprisal if their letters sounded too friendly toward America. Yet even with censor's ink blotting out sentences, the fragments that survived spoke volumes. A captured soldier from the Africa Corps wrote in late 1943, "We are treated according to the Geneva Convention. Food is adequate. I am in good health. We have meat every day." The last phrase was struck through by the censor. Another letter intercepted at Camp Aliceville, Alabama, contained the astonished line,
They give us white bread, butter, and coffee. Only the word coffee remained uncensored. The rest was blacked out. U.S. officials worried that such admissions would demoralize German civilians struggling with rationing and hunger. Still, hints slipped through. Red Cross monitors who reviewed the POW mail system recorded repeated German complaints about censorship. The best parts of my letters are removed. Yet even the censored versions revealed more than intended. Families back home could read between the lines. When a son wrote, "I am gaining strength and my clothes no longer hang so loose," his parents understood more than the censor realized. American guards often found the prisoners' attempts at secrecy amusing. One remembered how men drew tiny pictures, a loaf of bread, a steaming cup, a candy bar, hoping the censors would overlook them. Most of the time they were noticed and blacked out, but some sketches slipped through, cryptic signals of abundance that German families puzzled over. From the U.S. perspective, censorship was both a duty and a weapon. The Office of Censorship explicitly instructed camp officers to allow neutral, reassuring lines, but suppress details that revealed America's prosperity. As one directive put it, "We do not feed the German home front with candy bars and cigarettes through careless mail." Yet the irony was obvious. Even censored letters still carried a subtext. Their writers were alive, healthy, and evidently not mistreated. This fact alone contradicted Nazi propaganda, which claimed that German POWs in America were starved, beaten, or executed. Intelligence officers tracked these letters carefully. A 1944 memorandum from XII Fighter Command noted, "Prisoner correspondence provides indirect psychological pressure on the German home front. Families who read that sons are safe in U.S. camps may question the veracity of German claims about American brutality." For the prisoners themselves, writing became an act of negotiation. They wanted to reassure families, but also wanted to hint at the astonishing reality. A diary confiscated by a POW.
Camp Swift recorded his frustration. They cut out the best sentences. "My mother will not believe that I eat chocolate here. If she could see it with her own eyes, she would weep." Letters were also a battlefield of morale. Hardened Nazis in the camps sometimes accused their comrades of exaggerating American kindness. "Write only what is necessary," one officer warned. But even terse lines carried unintended weight. When a son told his father, "I am being treated well according to international law," the phrase itself hinted that conditions were not dire. U.S. guards understood the power of this correspondence. Sergeant Paul Schmidt, whose parents had emigrated from Germany, remarked in his oral history, "The letters were better propaganda than anything we printed." A few words about good health meant more to a German mother than 1,000 leaflets. By war's end, millions of POW letters had crossed the Atlantic, each bearing traces of astonishment carefully trimmed by the censor's pen. Some German families preserved them as heirlooms, still puzzled decades later by the fragments. "I am well. I eat every day. We have," before the black line cut off the rest. Even in silence, the truth spoke. The very act of censoring abundance confirmed it existed. Families knew their sons were not starving, even if they could not know just how much butter and sugar filled their plates. Thus, in pencil and ink, through words erased and words aloud, German prisoners carried home a message their captors never fully intended. America's strength was not only in weapons, but in the generosity it could afford even its enemies. Daily life in the American POW camps extended beyond food and work. For many German prisoners, survival meant finding meaning in small rituals, faith, music, and fellowship. The camp environment, surprisingly humane, allowed those elements to flourish in ways they had not anticipated. Religious observance formed the first foundation. The Geneva Convention guaranteed prisoners the right to worship, and the U.S. Army honored it. At Camp Crossville, Tennessee, a chapel was set aside for Sunday services. German pastors, themselves prisoners, conducted services in their native tongue. Guards often stood at the back, listening quietly. One chaplain later noted in his report, "The men sing loudly, as though to remind themselves of home." Hymns like Ein feste Burg echoed through barracks, steadying morale. For some prisoners, American chaplains offered more than tolerance. They offered kindness. At Camp Swift, Texas, a Catholic priest arranged for German POWs to receive rosaries, Bibles, and prayer books through local church donations. This astonished many men who had expected hostility. In one Red Cross inspection, a prisoner commented, "They even allow us to pray for Germany." To him, this freedom reflected strength, not weakness. Music soon became as important as faith. Camps with large populations organized orchestras using donated instruments. Camp Aliceville's orchestra grew to nearly 40 members by 1944.
They performed symphonies, marches, and folk songs attended by both prisoners and American guards. Oral histories describe guards applauding German renditions of Beethoven and Strauss, even requesting encores. Informal music filled the rest of the time. Accordions, harmonicas, and makeshift guitars created evening gatherings in the barracks. A former POW later recalled, "After roll call, someone always played. It lifted the gloom and reminded us we were still human beings." Army reports noted that music reduced disciplinary problems and created a calmer environment. The U.S. military encouraged these activities not out of sentiment, but out of strategy. Morale made camps easier to manage, and creative outlets minimized unrest. Yet the prisoners themselves often saw these allowances as proof of American civilization. In contrast, many had expected brutal repression. Community life extended further. Camps allowed prisoners to form clubs, chess groups, theater troupes, even academic circles. At Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, POWs staged plays, complete with costumes sewn from scrap cloth. American guards often attended, curious to see German humor and drama. When they staged a parody of camp life, guards laughed alongside the prisoners, a moment of shared humanity in a war otherwise defined by enmity. Medical care also reinforced the sense of dignity. Prison doctors treated POW illnesses with the same seriousness as American soldiers. U.S. Army Medical Department records show German prisoners hospitalized for pneumonia, appendicitis, and broken bones received surgery and convalescent care without discrimination. At Camp Hearn, Texas, German patients marveled that American nurses visited daily, sometimes even bringing flowers donated by local church groups. Faith and music often intertwined with this medical care. Chaplains prayed at hospital bedsides. Orchestras performed for the sick. The contrast to their memories of wartime Germany, where resources were scarce and the wounded often neglected, could not have been starker. Even discipline reflected a balance of firmness and respect. Guards enforced rules, but also engaged prisoners in conversation, traded songs, and occasionally shared news of the outside world. This human contact, more than official rations, eroded Nazi propaganda. A guard's simple gesture, handing a sick prisoner an orange or teaching him an American folk song, lingered in memory. By late 1944, a culture of mutual recognition had taken root. Prisoners began writing about our camp rather than the camp. One diary entry captured by censors read, "We work, we eat, we sing. Life here is strange, but not unbearable. Sometimes, when the orchestra plays, I forget we are prisoners." Post-war interviews confirmed the lasting impression. A former POW told researchers in 1972, "In America, we learned that faith was free, music was for everyone, and even enemies could be treated with dignity. It was impossible to hate a country that gave us bread and let us sing.
Thus, the community that grew inside barbed wire, shaped by chapels, concert halls, and infirmaries, became another quiet weapon of democracy. It demonstrated to German prisoners that strength was not measured only in bombs or tanks, but also in the ability to sustain faith, nourish culture, and extend humanity, even in wartime. By 1944, German POWs in the United States had settled into a rhythm of food, music, and faith. But nothing shocked them more than the work they were assigned. According to Geneva Convention rules, enlisted men could be compelled to perform non-military labor. The U.S. War Department, facing acute labor shortages with millions of Americans overseas, put prisoners to work in agriculture, forestry, and industry. What the Germans saw during these assignments shattered their illusions about American society. Agricultural labor became the most common task. In the wheat fields of Kansas, the cotton rows of Texas, and the orchards of California, POWs discovered the sheer scale of U.S. food production. They were driven in trucks past mile after mile of cultivated farmland, unlike anything they had known in Europe. One prisoner, writing in a censored letter, admitted, "We thought America was full of skyscrapers. Instead, it is full of endless farms. We see now why they can feed whole armies." The abundance left them speechless. They picked apples from trees so heavy with fruit that branches cracked under the weight. They cut wheat with modern machinery that completed in hours what would take dozens of men in Germany. A U.S. Department of Agriculture report recorded one POW exclaiming, "Every farmer here has more machines than our whole village." The prisoners were paid for their labor, another surprise. They earned 80 cents a day in canteen scrip, money not convertible to U.S. dollars, but usable inside the camp store. With it, they purchased toiletries, stationery, tobacco, and occasionally small luxuries like candy bars. Many found this incomprehensible. Sergeant Carl Merler later recalled, "We worked for the enemy and he paid us. Not only paid us, but allowed us to buy what his own soldiers ate. It was beyond reason." Civilian farmers who interacted with the prisoners left written accounts preserved in county archives. In Nebraska, one farmer remembered, "They were young, polite, and amazed at everything. They asked how many men I employed. When I told them none, it was just me, my wife, and 2 tractors, they could hardly believe it." Forestry details revealed another kind of abundance, natural resources. In Minnesota camps, prisoners cut lumber in forests stretching as far as the eye could see. One POW remarked during interrogation, "We were told America was running out of wood, that it was poor in natural resources. Now I see forests without end." Industry assignments reinforced these impressions. At Camp Huntsville, Texas, prisoners loaded rail cars of canned food bound for overseas. They saw pallets of Spam, crates of powdered milk, and barrels of coffee, commodities so scarce in wartime Germany that officers rarely tasted them. For many, this was the first time they comprehended the logistical miracle sustaining Allied armies. American supervisors noted their reactions. A quartermaster officer reported in October 1944, "The Germans express disbelief that such quantities exist. They often ask, 'Is this for the whole U.S. Army?' We tell them, 'No, only one corps.' Their faces betray the shock." The prisoners were not blind to contrasts. Back home, their families lived under rationing so severe that butter, meat, and even soap were luxuries. In America, they watched warehouses overflow with goods. In camp canteens, Hershey bars were stacked in bins, sold cheaply to anyone with scrip. Some men mailed the wrappers home, proof of what they had witnessed. The psychological effect was profound. Nazi propaganda had painted America as decadent, fractured, and weak.
Yet these labor details revealed a country of energy, machinery, and inexhaustible resources. A former Afrika Korps corporal testified in 1946, "Every day we worked, we saw power. Not military power, but the power of tractors, trains, and factories. It made us certain Germany could not win." Wages also encouraged subtle bonds. Farmers often provided extra food, watermelons in Texas, peaches in Georgia, fresh milk in Iowa. While officially discouraged, such generosity became common. In oral history interviews decades later, American farmers recalled sharing meals with the prisoners, even teaching them how to drive tractors. One farmer laughed, "They thought I was a king because I had 2 combines. They asked if I was rich. I told them, no, I'm just average." In POW letters, this theme recurred. One prisoner wrote, "The Americans are not starving. They live well, and they allow us to live well also. They have food for all and machines for all. If this is decadence, I wish Germany had more of it."